I don't suppose that I need to introduce Jordan Peterson, who has become probably one of the world's foremost intellectuals. He has written a new book called Beyond Order. That is a follow-up to his 12 Rules for Life. It contains 12 more rules for life, and I've just made my way through this, and I thought I would summarise the book for you and introduce you to some of the main ideas and rules that he presents. They follow much the same kind of approach as the previous book, but they go further and into more detail. So let me begin by summarising rule number 1 for you. Rule number 1 is: do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. Well, let me give you an example of what that's about. I visited a restaurant in Toronto with my wife and son and daughter while writing this. And as I made my way to my party's table, a young waiter asked if he might say a few words to me. He told me that he had been watching my videos, listening to my podcasts, and reading my book, and that he had, in consequence, changed his attitude towards his comparatively lower status but still useful and necessary job. He had ceased criticising what he was doing, or himself for doing it, and decided instead to be grateful and to seek out whatever opportunities presented themselves right there before him. He made up his mind to become more diligent and reliable, and to see what would happen if he worked as hard as he could. He told me, with an uncontrived smile, that he had been promoted 3 times in 6 months. It's useful, says Peterson, to be able to take your place at the bottom of the hierarchy. But in order to do that, you need to have both humility and gratitude. Without that, it can't be done. But do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. Rather, do your best to join in. Rule number 2 is, let me just pull this one up for you. Imagine who you could be and then aim single-mindedly at that. He says this in this chapter: aim at something, pick the best target that you can currently conceptualize, and stumble toward it. Note your errors and your misconceptions along the way, face them, and correct them. Get your story straight, your past, the present, and the future, because they all matter. You need to map your path. You need to know where you were so that you don't repeat the mistakes of the past. And you need to know where you are so that you will not be able to draw a line without that from the starting point to your destination. And you need to know where you're going, or you'll drown in uncertainty and unpredictability and chaos, and you'll starve for hope and inspiration. He goes on to say, aim at something profound and noble and lofty. If you can find a better path along the way, then once you've started moving forward, switch course. But with luck and with will, you'll find a story that is meaningful and productive and improves itself with time, and perhaps even provides you with more than a few moments of satisfaction and of joy. With will and luck, you will be the hero of that story and the disciplined sojourner, the creative transformer, and the benefactor of your family, and maybe even the broader society. Imagine who you could be, and then aim single-mindedly at that. Rule number 3 says, do not hide unwanted things in the fog. Then he goes on to tell the story about his father-in-law We've been married for many, many, many years, and one day, without warning, he snapped at his wife, saying, "Why in the world do we always eat off these tiny plates? I hate eating off these tiny plates." Apparently, his wife was somewhat taken aback and mildly shocked by the outburst, simply because for the fact for 30 years he'd never ever mentioned it before. Consequence, says Peterson? Well, the lesson he draws is, do not pretend that you're happy with something if you're not. And if a reasonable solution might in principle be negotiated, then go for it. Have the damn fight, unpleasant as it might be in the moment. It's one less straw on the camel's back. And that is particularly true for those daily events that everyone is prone to regard as merely trivial. Even the plates on which you eat your lunch. Because life is what repeats, and it's worth getting what repeats right. So, lesson number 3. Do not hide unwanted things in the fog. Lesson number 4. Notice that opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated. If you want to become invaluable in your workplace, says Peterson, in any community, just do the useful things which no one else is doing. Arrive earlier and leave later than your compatriots, but, don't deny yourself your own life, of course. Organise what you can see is dangerously disorganised. Work, and when you're working, instead of looking like you are working. And finally, learn more about the business. Learn more about the competitors than you already know. Doing that will make you invaluable, a veritable linchpin. People will notice that, and they'll begin to appreciate your own hard-earned merits. Notice the opportunities that lurk where responsibility has been abdicated. Pick them up and run with them, and you'll be the main beneficiary. Rule number 5. Do not do what you hate. He says, I once had a client who was subject to a barrage of constant idiocy as part of her work in a giant corporation. She was a sensible, honest person who had withstood and managed a difficult life, and who genuinely wished to contribute and work in a manner commensurate with her good sense and honesty. She became subject, while employed in the corporate environment, to a long, in-person, email-mediated dispute about the term flip chart. It's a common phrase, referring to a large pad of paper which you typically write on, standing on a tripod. But they said it was, in fact, a term of abuse. And flip was apparently, at one time, a derogatory term for Filipino. I couldn't find any evidence of it in use now, but he says, even though the former slur had nothing whatsoever to do with flip charts, the administrators of her firm felt, at that time, it was well spent discussing the hypothetical prejudicial nature of the phrase and formulating a replacement phrase, the use of which eventually became mandatory amongst employees. They all had to use, apparently, the term writing block instead. My client, he says, tried to make sense of what she was witnessing. Such discussions give people a superficial sense of being good and noble and compassionate and open-hearted and wise. And so, if for the sake of argument anyone disagrees, how could that person join the discussion without being considered incompassionate, narrow-minded, racist, wicked? And he goes on to say that she was also perturbed by the idea that no one in her workplace was apparently bothered that any given group of people might just endow themselves with the authority to just ban words. Anyway, as a consequence of that, The price she paid for standing up and fighting, well, she says here, to begin with, she had to face her fear of reprisal, as well as the fact that, well, such fear in combination with the profound distaste she felt for the ideological manoeuvres characterizing her workplace was destroying her interest in her office and in her profession, as well as making her feel inadequate and cowardly. So Peterson suggests instead that one you should do, make a stand about what you believe in. Don't allow other people to crush your spirit, and do not do what you hate. That was lesson 5. Lesson number 6 is abandon ideology. Ideology, he says, is the product of 20th century cults. The belief in these cults are simultaneously naive and narcissistic, and the activism which they promote is resentful and a lazy person's substitute for actual accompaniment. The single axioms of ideologically possessed are gods served blindly by their proselytizers. Like God, however, according to Nietzsche, ideology is dead. The bloody excesses of the 20th century have killed that off. We should just let it go and begin to address and consider smaller, more precisely defined problems that we can deal with. We should conceptualize them at the scale at which they might begin to solve them, not blaming others, but by trying to address them personally while simultaneously taking responsibility for the outcome. So what he says is, have some humility, clean up your bedroom, take care of your family, follow your conscience, straighten up your life, find something productive and interesting to do, and commit to it. And when you have done all that, find a bigger problem, and then try and solve that if you dare to. If that works too, move on to even more ambitious projects. And as necessity beginning to process, abandon ideology. Rule number 7 is work as hard as you possibly can on at least one thing and see what happens. So, we have an idea. If you work as hard as you can on one thing, he says, you will change. You will start to become one thing, instead of clamouring for a multitude of things that you often were clamouring for. And that one thing, developed properly, is not only the disciplined entity formed by sacrifice and commitment and concentration, it's also that one thing which will create and destroy and transform discipline itself and civilization itself. It transforms that too by expressing its unity of personality and the society. It's the very word of truth upon whose function all habitual order wrenched out of chaos eternally depends. Work as hard as you possibly can on one thing and see what happens. Rule number 8. Try to make one room in your home as beautiful as possible. Peterson confesses that he's not terribly good at carrying this rule out, but he still thinks it's a valuable rule to follow. He says, I have become known for encouraging people to clean up their rooms. Perhaps that's because I'm serious about the prosaic piece of advice, because, well, I know it's a much more difficult task than it appears. He goes on then to share some of his failures about that, but still, he says, making something beautiful is important to do, as well as being difficult. He says, but it's amazingly worthwhile. If you learn to make something in your life truly beautiful, even just one thing, he says, then you have established a relationship with beauty itself. And from there you can begin to expand that relationship out into other elements of your life and out into the world too. That's an invitation to, well, nothing less than the divine itself. And that's the recognition with it's a reconnection with the immortality of childhood and the true beauty and majesty of the being that you can no longer see. And he says you've got to be daring to try that. So, rule number 8. Try to make one room in your home as beautiful as possible. Rule number 9. If old memories still upset you, write them down carefully and completely. Imagine that you undertook some terrible actions in the past. You betrayed or you hurt people in a genuinely damaging manner. You damaged their reputation with gossip and innuendo, or you took credit for their work maybe. You robbed them materially, spiritually. You cheated on them. Or imagine instead that you have been the target of some such events. You're the victim. And also let's assume that you've become wise enough to try to avoid repeating that experience and you won't go there again. In both circumstances, whether as perpetrator or as victim, the actual events and the associated memories just evoke, well, in you fear and guilt and shame. Why is that? Well, in the first case, you have betrayed yourself. You didn't play the medium to long-term game properly, and you're suffering the consequences. And you're not the sort of person that other people would choose to have around. You might not even be the sort of person that you want to have around. And in the second case, you are badly mistreated by someone else. And in some real sense, it does not matter whether you are suffering because of betrayal or at the hands of other people. What does matter is that you don't desire any reoccurrence. Now, if you can recall that kind of memory, if it comes back to you unbidden and complete with terror and shame and guilt, this means something specific. It means that you fell into a hole, a pit more exactly, and you were pushed there, and you're not in a very good position. What do? Well, you have to learn from the past. Or, if you don't learn from the past, you will repeat its horrors endlessly. Frequently, people do not so much repress the terrible things that happened in the past, as they refuse to think them through, and therefore they refuse to push them out of their minds, and they occupy themselves with other activities. And that's a real problem, because unless you confront things courageously, even the painful things, you will not get through them, and you will not get over them. Peterson's advice: if your old memories still upset you, write them down carefully and completely. Rule number 10. Plan and work diligently to maintain the romance in your relationship. What Peterson suggests here is that you must not be naive. You must not expect beautiful relationships to just thrive entirely by themselves. They need to be worked at. Do not expect the beauty of love to maintain itself without all-out effort on your part. Distribute the requirements of your household in a manner that you find both acceptable, and do not tyrannize or subject yourself to slavery. Decide what you need to keep yourself satisfied both in bed and out of it, and maybe, just maybe, you will maintain the love of your life and you will have a friend and a confidant in this cold rock that we live on the far end of the cosmos. And it'll be a little bit warmer and a little bit more comforting than otherwise it would be. And you are going to need that because rough times are always on their way. and you better have something to set against them, or despair will just visit you and will never depart. Plan, therefore, and work diligently to maintain romance in your relationship. Rule number 11. Do not allow yourself to become resentful, deceitful, or arrogant. Here is something which I learnt in my years as a clinician, or a clinical psychologist. I constantly saw people who were hurt by life. They had their reasons for feeling resentful, and those reasons were often far from trivial. I would propose this. I'd say, let's take your problems apart, even though many of them are real. Let's try and figure out which of them are your fault, because some of them are going to be, and some of them alternatively are just, well, they're just a catastrophe of life. And we will delineate that very carefully. And then we will start having you practice overcoming whatever it is that you're bringing into the situation that's just making it worse. You'll confront those problems that you're bringing. You'll start to make some strategic plans about how you might confront the parts of your life which are just truly tragic, and will get you to do that in a truthful, open and courageous manner. And then we'll watch what happens. But most of the people I met, they got better. Not always, but most of them did. Encouragement prepared them to be confident of their problems and to confront them head on, and that voluntary confrontation dispelled some of their fear. This was not because things around them became less dangerous, but because the people facing the danger became braver. If you have a problem, then don't run away, says Peterson. It might take some time to build up the courage, but once you face the problem and realize you can overcome it, that's the only way forward. The last rule, rule number 12. Be grateful in spite of your suffering. Peterson has this final word for us to say. He says, I do not believe that you can be appropriately grateful or thankful for what good you have and for what evil has not yet befallen you, until you have some profound and even terrifying sense of the weight of existence. You cannot properly appreciate what you have unless you also have some sense not only of how terrible things could be, but how terrible it's likely for things to be, given how easy it is for things to be so. This is something that's very much worth knowing. Otherwise, you might find yourself tempted to ask, why would I ever look into the darkness? Thus, you look into the dark places to protect yourself in case the darkness ever appears. You look into the darkness as well to find the light, and there's real utility in that. Rule number 12. Be grateful in spite of your suffering. So, Jordan Peterson, Beyond Order, 12 more rules for life. That's a summary of the rules which he's provided for us, and they're no less more demanding and no less more profound than his previous book.